This is a very exciting moment, and in two ways. I want to first of all thank Augustine and the authority for bringing this event here. I think it's very good to be able to present it to a group of people who are architects and architects in formation, and to have a more intimate conversation than we would have under other circumstances. So I'm very, very appreciative of that, and I hope that Chinese U is also participating, although I don't recognize the faces. Next, it's an exciting moment because if the projects are really going to be delivered in mid-May, this is the moment, if you were doing a theater production in which you had brought the best people together, the best technologies together in the best theater, you had gotten the best playwrights or libretticists or whomever, and the curtain's about to go up. And no matter how good the effort, the big question is there. Maybe this is a naughty question. Flop or success? What are we going to have when the curtain goes up? So I'd like to put it in that context. There's always the possibility of a flop. In Broadway, we know that all too well. No matter how much money you put into something, no matter how talented and intelligent the people are, and this is certainly an extraordinarily talented and intelligent group, one has to do this thing correctly in order for it to not be a flop. So let's presume it's not going to be a flop. I'm a little bit like the architects here. When I saw the title, I was horrified. City versus architecture, Godzilla versus King Kong. Because I come from a culture in which it would inevitably not be that way. It would be architecture and or both the city. However, let's talk for a second about oppositional pairs. As a young teacher, of course, I delved into oppositional pairs. This is wet, this is dry, this is hot, this is cold, this is dense, this is loose, this is a grid, this is not a grid. This is a servant space, that's a served space. And under intense questioning from the students that I had in those days, I won't tell you how many years ago it was, I began to question the value of oppositional pairs in architecture. To me, it was reducing things to a simplistic level that was impossible to describe. You know, is this a served table or a servant table? Is this infrastructure or is it building? Is this landscape or is it infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, I'm going to indulge myself by pretending oppositional pairs don't really exist. And when I got here and found out about East versus West, I was horrified. It was, again, King Kong versus Godzilla. So I've tried, at least in my deanship, to try to avoid reducing the world to oppositional pairs. Planning versus buildings, East versus West. So in that context, let me start by throwing a question out. The thing I sensed in looking at this, although it's not, was not completely consistent, is the three of you tried to represent this question, and by the way, I didn't see any of you endorsing the question. I think you were on my side in this. It was local context versus your own buildings. It wasn't what I would have thought, which is local context versus universal or more general urban strategies. And to what degree can a building be projective and prospective about a larger idea of the city, and to what degree can it be itself and independent of a bigger idea? Or to what degree can it be immediately part of and generated by the local context, something which, at least in my own work, I would say is more typically impossible. You can tell clients that it's generated by the local context, but chances are you would have done the same thing anyway. So I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about the possibility of and both, which is local context and both, a vision you have of the city, regardless of Hong Kong, Paris, Copenhagen, New York.
Or West Kowloon?
No, in general. No, general theory. You're not allowed to.
We were about to leave the stage.
Yeah. Listen. You've got to carry a fantasy around in your head, which is, what is a city? If I had no constraints, what would a city be? Versus, given all the contingencies of a very complicated site, and it's correct to describe it as a complicated site, how do you take that general vision of a city, not the buildings you've done in the past, and fit that in and mold that so that you can and both?
That would probably be the most difficult problem ever. I would suspect, actually, because I guess probably all of us would say that actually that all the buildings that we do, we'd like to think they were incredibly contextual. I think probably all the slides that we showed tried to sort of prove that. And I think although sometimes people say that actually the buildings that we do, and you're sort of implying actually that we would say that building is incredibly contextual, but actually isn't, I think probably we would actually really argue that it was. So therefore, if you're in a situation where there is no context, or you're putting yourself in some idealized utopian world where it's all your own context, actually then how do you design from that point of view? What are the parameters that you would design to? It would be probably the most difficult challenge, I think, whether we are in West Kowloon with the majestic harbour on one side and the not quite so majestic Kowloon station behind. And what that throws up is on the one hand fantastic, on the other hand not quite so fantastic. But at least it's something that we can work with and that we can begin to develop and respond to. And I guess any given site, wherever it might be, always has those challenges and opportunities. It always has something that we can all respond to. So to take any of this and abstract it out, I guess begins to be sort of the context which was implied in David's 1 square kilometre city in Dubai, and the Masdar project that we referred to as well, which was one of the most complex things that we had to generate, because you're given a piece of desert, and therefore how do you define a city? What is it that is this city? What is the context that you're developing for yourself? How do you make this thing work? So in terms of the projects that we've done, that was probably the most difficult, because to invent the reasons, to invent the rationale behind it is probably the most difficult task of all.
Well, two things. First of all, you mentioned about an ideal city, that we should be thinking about an ideal city. I don't think that exists, because to think about a city, you have to make certain decisions. First of all, who is going to live in that city? And once you decide on who, whether it's, well, I'm not being racial, but if it's Westerners, North Americans, Chinese, Japanese, that gives you a context. They give you a social context, because they would expect different spatial qualities, different scales, different social patterns, even whether you would like to live all within a family, or whether you would like to live as far away as possible from your in-laws. This sort of thing would govern the shape of a city. So you need that context. And then secondly, you have to decide whether you are talking about an inland city, or whether you're talking about a coastal city, or whether you're talking about a city on the river, by the river. Now that gives you a physical context. And once you have that physical context, then you have the climatic conditions related to that location. And therefore you will have that natural context. Now, all these, I believe, would then affect your architecture. It should affect your architecture to a certain extent. And then the more detailed in scale you go into it, like whether the people in the city would like to drive, or whether they would like more to take trains or buses, then give you the infrastructural arrangement. And that again would have a knock-on effect, or it should have an effect on the architecture. And therefore, I think that this relationship between architecture and the city is very intimate. It's one that we should not overlook lightly, and it's one that we should work towards ensuring that it is a mutually complementary relationship rather than a totally disinterested relationship, or worse still, an opposing sort of relationship. So that would be my thought. And of course, West Kowloon would benefit if it were the relationship that I talked about, one where the urban form and the architecture is mutually complementary, and where the social context and climatic context are all taken into account.